Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, depending where you are in the world. It is my sincere pleasure to welcome you all to another edition of the Willard Brown International Business Leadership Webinar Series, jointly organized by the School of Business of the American University in Cairo and the American Chamber of Commerce in Egypt. I just hope that you all, your family, your loved ones, your friends, your neighbors are all safe and in good health. For a few decades, whenever we talked about disruption, we talked about information and communication technologies, artificial intelligence, digital transformation, more recently, the fourth industrial revolution, the future of work, the future of learning, the impact of innovation on society when it comes to manufacturing, agriculture, trade, healthcare, education, retailing, and the list is long. The way people are going to work, study, shop, communicate, get entertained, and so on and so forth. But late in 2019, disruption came in a different shape and form. It's called COVID-19. It was like a perfect storm, a stealth attack, an invisible enemy that probably nobody expected it. It affected with no discrimination the developed world, but also emerging economies. It affected people's lives, livelihoods, individuals, organizations, whether they are big or small. Ironically, in many ways, digital transformation, which was looked at as the disrupting factor, saved the day to a great extent. There's no one way to think about it when we think of a pandemic as something positive, but there is always an opening whenever there is a challenge. I always believe that with every opportunity that's come with a challenge, we opened up more solutions. And I think what we've been going through over the past few weeks and months creates a fantastic opportunity for digital transformation, but also innovation at large. For starters, the impact of the magnitude of the pandemic pushed people to adapt and adapt quickly. And I always like the notion that the CIOs and the CTOs of the world, no matter what they've done over the past few decades, COVID-19 beat them all. And it managed to push digital transformation across different society much faster. How will the acceleration of digitization look like in the post-COVID world is extremely important. And it's an integral element of our day-to-day conversations. However, for digitization to have a sustainable and scalable impact, it needs not just the required infrastructure, but also it needs the investments, the readiness of the society. It needs the human capital, but also the innovation capital that is there. Societies change all the time, but they will always want to remain competitive, remain agile, to be able to move to the next step. And I think more than ever, this is exactly what we're looking for. To discuss these issues and more, I'm extremely delighted to have in today's webinar, Professor Soumitra Dutta, a good old friend and a global authority on how issues related to driving business innovation and growth through the right combination of people and technology, while also addressing issues related to readiness and competitiveness. Soumitra will address today the topic of technology and innovation competitiveness for a post-COVID world. But please first allow me to introduce Soumitra. He's a professor of management and former founding dean of the Johnson College of Business at Cornell University in New York. Previously, he was the Anne and Elmer Lintas Dean of the Johnson Graduate School of Management. Prior to joining Cornell, he was a faculty member at INSEAD. He is currently the chair of the board of directors of the Global Business Schools Network, a not-for-profit organization focused on improving management capacity in emerging markets. He's the founder of the Global Innovation Index, published by the World Intellectual Property Organization, and was the co-editor of the Global Innovation Technology Report, published by the World Economic Forum. Two influential reports in technology and innovation policy. He's also the founder and president of Portulans Institute, a nonpartisan, not-profit research and education institution based in Washington, D.C. Thank you very much, Soumitra, for joining us today. The floor is all yours.
Thank you very much, Dean Kamel, for your very kind introduction. You're a good friend and also an expert on technology innovations, so it's a pleasure to be invited to share this session with you. Good evening, good afternoon, and good morning to all our viewers, depending on which time zone you are in. I would like to begin by, of course, wishing you and all your family members good health, because we are in a very, very interesting time period right now where the global pandemic is still in progress. Surprisingly, we had thought that by the summer, the pandemic would have receded and we'd be preparing for the second wave. But what we are seeing that in many parts of the world, even the first wave is not yet over. So really, we are in the midst of the first wave of the pandemic. And I really hope that the first priority is for all of us to be safe and to keep our family and friends safe. Now, I was asked to share a few words about technology. And certainly technology innovation is very, very central and very important for all of us. It's a domain where I have spent a good 3 decades of my professional life researching and thinking about this area. And I wanted to share with you just a few brief thoughts to kick off the discussion. And then I'm sure you will have many additional points or comments that you'd like to raise. And I'd love to be able to engage in interactive discussion with you all. So the first point I'd like to make is, yes, it is true that digitalization has been accelerated in a fairly significant manner. If you listen to the CEOs of organizations, including the tech giants, IBM, Google, and others, speak today, they all say that what has happened in the last, let's say, 4 months would have normally taken 5 years or more to happen in most industries. And education is certainly a good one to consider, because education is an industry where generally we were quite slow in making progress, generally quite slow in adopting technology en masse. And there were a lot of faculty members and students who were a bit skeptical about the whole possibility of moving education online. And then, of course, come COVID, and with no choice and with little preparation, fundamentally, all universities, or pretty much a large number of universities and schools all around the world, had to move the teaching online. It is a huge dramatic shift that normally would have happened over several years, but this all happened compressed in a few weeks or a few months in most cases. Now, I think it tells us 2 very important messages. The first message is that it can be done. So a lot of things that we assumed would require a certain mode of operation, a certain mode of living and working, we're taking for granted, but there is no reason to take it for granted. So education can be done, and so is remote working. And large-scale remote working is now a possibility. It's something that people have engaged in many countries around the world. And that actually points to this reservoir of hidden innovation potential that we all have inside us individually and inside our organizations. So, we never knew that a business school or a company could actually innovate that dramatically in a short period of time. So I think the first message really is that we have this innovation potential and we should actually leverage it. We should be proud of it. We should celebrate it. The second message linked to this whole rapid digitalization in the last few months has been that we are only touching the initial phases. So let's say education, we should not assume that online education, the way we have seen it over the last 3-4 months, the way we have professors take their classroom materials and move it to a Zoom or Microsoft Teams format, is the way of the future. In fact, what is going to happen is there's going to be tremendous, tremendous experimentation in the next 5 years. And in 5 years' time, online education will look very, very different from what it is today. Already you're seeing a lot of experimentation happening in online events where you have all kinds of humanoids and augmented reality situations playing out, and these will become more mainstream. In fact, if you look at the history of how technology has impacted society, impacted our lives, people typically talk about 3 stages. So the first stage is simple substitution. So whenever there's a new technology that comes in, is invented, and it is better, cheaper than the old technology, people start using the new technology instead of the old technology. An example being, let's say the combustion engine is invented, cars are invented, people start traveling by cars instead of by horse carriages. The second stage of technology impact is diffusion. where just because the technology is cheaper, easier to use, and more effective in many ways, people start using it more and more. So cars became more widespread, and essentially the use of horses went away completely about 100 years ago. Similarly, the same story applies to mobile phones and other kinds of technology revolutions. But the third stage of impact is the one which is more impactful, which is transformation. So it goes from substitution, diffusion to transformation. Transformation happens when the number of people using the same technology is so large that fundamentally you can come up with new ways of living and working. So in the car example, the whole creation of shopping malls, the whole creation of suburbs became possible because everyone had cars, or at least a large proportion of the population had cars. And now I think what's going to happen is, because remote working, remote learning has become so widespread, we're going to see a lot of transformation in the way education is structured, delivered, and so on. So don't ever think that we have seen the end of digitalization of education or of industry and so on. So I think we are really at a very important threshold where we'll see more and more happening in the future. So that was, in a sense, one of my first points I wanted to make, was this rapid phase of digitalization that we have seen. And that is something which is only in the initial phases. We're going to see more and more change in the years ahead. Now, second point I wanted to make is linked to some of my more research points that are linked to the Global Innovation Index and the Network Readiness Index. Now, these are two global indices that I have been researching over the last 20 years in the case of the Network Readiness Index, and the last 13 years in the case of the Global Innovation Index. The Global Innovation Index and the Network Readiness Index are both easily accessible and downloadable on the web. Just please search for them and you'll find them very easily. It's all free download. Now, those two pieces of research have for a long time been the dominant pieces of work in how you assess the innovation readiness of nations and the technology competitiveness of nations. So let me just share with you, having done this research for the last 2 decades, some very high-level results that we have found. First of all, let me just put it in context with what is happening right now. So clearly, one of the big questions that people ask right now is, will the amount of money invested in innovation go down? As a result of the crisis, as a result of all the fiscal issues that companies and governments are facing, what will happen to innovation going forward? Now, what I can tell you is that if you just look at the most recent crisis, that is about 10, 12 years ago, 2008, 2009, when we had the financial crisis, a similar question was asked, will the financial crisis in fact lead to a reduction in innovation investments? Now, 10 years later, we have the data for that. And what is interesting to see is that in the last decade, we have seen a divergence in the GDP growth rates and the innovation investment rates. So historically, before 2008, usually the innovation investment rates mirrored or paralleled the GDP growth rates. But what has happened in the last 10 years is that the innovation rates have in fact risen far more rapidly than the GDP growth rates in most parts of the world. In fact, in many countries after the crisis, the innovation investment rates did not decrease, in fact, went up in some countries. How did that happen? That happened because the private sector stepped in. So it is true that after the last crisis, the governments, in fact, reduced the investments in innovation in many cases. But the good news is the governments, the private sector stepped in, and the private sector ramped up their investments in innovation. And this is especially true because the whole digital revolution has really accelerated in the last 10 years. And many companies in the private sector, not just tech companies, but even finance companies, retail companies, pharmaceutical companies, across sectors, people have invested more and more in digital innovation. So what you're seeing is that in the last 10 years, innovation investment rates have gone up, higher than GDP growth rates. And it's an open question about what will happen in the next 10 years and beyond. But if you ask me, I would put my money on the fact that the innovation rates will keep on being strong. Why? Because private sector knows that a lot of the innovation is possible with new technology generations, technology progress. And for leveraging that progress, you need to keep investing in innovation. Now, also what is interesting is to see the state of entrepreneurs around the world. Now, what is true is that entrepreneurship, of course, comes in a variety of different forms and shapes and sizes. And one measure of entrepreneurship is the number of venture capital deals. Now, one disturbing trend has been that the number of venture capital deals, in fact, has fallen in the last few months. In the first half of this year, number of deals have fallen, partly because I think this is not a new trend. There was a trend of declining deals already happening worldwide. And this was a result of some different, let's say, venture capital trends of backing the unicorns, the big bets, SoftBank style, put huge amounts of money in a few large companies, a few big bets, as opposed to distributing the money in many other smaller bets. And it remains to be seen how the trend changes over time. So we have seen a decline in entrepreneurship deals funded by VCs in the last few months, but I do hope that trend reverses as the logic of having funded to a large degree only a few unicorns is now questioned by the current problems that unicorns, the supposed unicorns like WeWorks and even to some degree, Uber and Airbnb and all are facing right now. So there might be redistribution of entrepreneurial funding in the coming months. Now, we have had the benefit of studying technology, innovation, trends in countries around the world over the last 20 years. And I'm often asked the question, what are some general, sort of lessons you can draw from this? There are many lessons you can draw, and every country has its own path. So there's no one unique path for all countries. But if you ask me, I think one very important message, a few important messages are as follows. So one is you need to have a national ambition, a national policy to drive technology innovation. If that does not happen, it does not often happen organically. The whole story that somehow bottom up comes up organically is not really completely true. Of course, people talk about China and Korea as being good examples of the more centrally driven, more central leadership. A strong government support has been true even in the case of the US history of technology and science innovations. Even now in the US government, there is a whole act called Endless Frontier Act being proposed to ramp up dramatically the amount of investments that the government supports in science and technology innovation, especially in light of the competitive threat that China poses to US scientific leadership. So the national ambition is very important, and what we find is that it's very important for a country to at least orchestrate a policy of investment in science, technology, innovation. The second thing what we find is very important, of course, is human capital. People are at the source of ideas. People's creativity lead to great things, and investing in human capital is absolutely vital. For that, the best way of investing, of course, education. Schools, universities are extremely important. And I know that Egypt, for example, is one of the countries in the Middle East with great human talent. And you need great universities like AUC to be able to build that human talent. So I think this focus on building great universities is extremely important. Even if you take, let's say, one of the top universities in the world, like Stanford University's great contribution is not necessarily the research produced by its faculty. Yes, the faculty are wonderful, they've done great research, but Stanford University's best contribution really is all these wonderful companies that have been set up by the graduates of Stanford University. The graduates who benefited from top quality faculty doing top quality research at the university. So the university really acts as a magnet for talent and essentially creates that hub from where great talent can nurture themselves, develop themselves, and can go and create wonderful new companies and wonderful new employment opportunities for others. So I think universities, human talent is very critical. The third element, which is very critical, is little bit different across income groups. So we have had the luxury of having different income group countries that we've analyzed and monitored over the years. And the results are a little bit different for high income group countries and the low income group countries. So in the low income group countries, what we see is very important for helping drive innovation and technology and growth and GDP and so on is the environment. When I'm saying the environment, I'm using it very general terms in a broad definition. Environment in terms of regulations, in the judicial environment, in terms of other kinds of political stability. So the more stable the environment, the more well-developed the rules and policies supporting business, the higher the rate of growth in less developed economies. In higher income economies, usually most high income economies have already benefited from a stable environment. They have well-developed rules and codes of law and procedures and so on. So the real difference that we see in the high-income economies is in the investments in digital technology. The more they invest in digital technologies, the more they're able to grow successfully and dramatically. So in some sense, we see a different kind of a focus being more important in economies at different levels of development. This does not mean that digital is not important for low-income economies. Of course, digital is very important for low-income economies. What I'm just saying is that you can have a lot of digital, but if you don't have the right environment, you will not get the full benefits. So it's very important to be able to focus and build on the right capabilities. Similarly, for the developed economies, you can have great talent and great other kinds of environmental factors. But if you do not invest in technology, you will not necessarily make the progress going forward. So those are some points from my research on the Global Innovation Index and on the Network Readiness Index. As I said, you can refer to them in more detail online. Let me close with a third set of comments. And the third set of comments is very much linked to some of my ongoing research right now. And that is very much with my concern and shared with my co-author, Dr. Bruno Landva, about what should be the digital agenda for the future. And here I always like to make this sort of picture of a pendulum swinging. If I go back and think 20 years ago, what was the general discussion around technology like? And I recall very vividly, the conferences, events, and other kinds of meetings we took part in. The discussion almost always was very positive. People were extremely keen about all the great things technology would bring, all the wonderful things that it would bring to the farmers, to the people in cities and rural areas and so on. And there was a mood of positive enthusiasm around technology. If I look at what is happening today, and I look at the discussion, the dialogue around technology, a lot of the discussion dialogue on technology is more around concerns around cybersecurity, around privacy, around breaches, around cyberbullying, around fake news, and so on. And people are questioning whether or not technology is being used, in fact, for good of society. The biases in AI algorithms, so on. The whole notion of how fair and how just the society and how technology are enabling, not enabling it. So in so many ways, I find the pendulum around technology has shifted more towards a concern, a more negative side of the debate. And I think the big challenge for us going forward is to swing the pendulum back towards a more harmonious center point where we're able to balance the good and the bad together. And this is very important because in some sense, that balance will only happen if you're able to understand that the future depends on us having a good governance structure across technology and people, because technology and people are the two key elements that will comprise a large part of our future, whether it's a personal life or professional life. And the big challenge really out here is how do we form the right governance structure? So let's make a simple example. AI is a very topical, let's say, technology that is on the frontier. And AI can be implemented in multiple ways in organizations. And we know that AI will be implemented in multiple ways in organizations in the years forward. But the whole question about how do you implement AI? What kind of data do you use to train the AI algorithms? How certain are you that that data does not actually create biases? how much effort are you putting in the validation of the results of the AI algorithms that you're putting into organizations? How much freedom and how much empowerment are you giving to managers to make decisions or to override the AI algorithms? Today, as you probably realize, in most hospitals, if you're a doctor looking at an X-ray of a patient, the machine gives you the X-ray, and the AI algorithm, in fact, gives you a diagnosis of the X-ray. And this is very similar to what happens in many cases today, for example, in banks, where you apply for a loan, and the system gives you a yes-no answer to the bank manager, telling the bank manager, should you, in fact, give the loan or not give the loan? Now, there's a lot of AI algorithms built behind these kinds of systems, and these systems are going to become more and more prevalent. But how do you ensure that human beings, we are able to understand what the system's actually doing and telling us to do, understand the reasons behind it, and does the system, the organizational system, in fact, give us the freedom and the privilege to be able to override the systems? So these systems have a very interesting sort of correlation or cohabitation with us. They help us, they support us, yet at the same time, if we don't support the human side of the equation, they can dominate us too as easily. So it's very important for us to be able to build this right kind of a cohabitation, co-governance structure between people, human beings, and technology. And I think that is going to be our overriding challenge going forward, because if we don't get that part right, we will not be able to build a good society. And you're seeing that already happen, those tensions, the pressures coming up. When we talk about the contact tracing apps and other kinds of more invasive apps that are being proposed right now in various countries. So the new digital agenda is really something that we have to think about very carefully. This is very similar to, for example, the new capitalism that people talk about, how capitalism has worked, but clearly hasn't worked for all areas, so it needs to be modified. Similarly, digital has worked, but has also created a lot of negative and possible concern areas. So we have to be more clever and more aggressive and show leadership in trying to address them more carefully and make sure that human beings are at the center of our technology discussions. Thank you very much, and over to you, Dean Kamel.
Soumitra, thank you so much. You've covered a lot of ground, a lot of issues. Let me just kickstart the conversation with a couple of points. People, I think in the innovation sort of formula, people always think of technology, platforms, applications, infrastructure. All of this is good. All of this is important. You've also touched upon the policy, the framework, which is, I think, is invaluable for people to innovate. But at the end of the day, it's people who innovate. Yet again, we live in a world, as I said in my opening remarks, that where people talk about change all the time, but they're always resisting to change. But they've seen something that they haven't seen before, and one must be over 102 years old, and even then he would have been just a baby to witness the Spanish flu. So moving forward, how do you think the experience that people around the world went through over the past 4 months in actually pushing people to be more adaptive, but also focusing on the people factor to develop them and accordingly develop what I think, especially in this part of the world, that is lacking, which is the innovation capital, the investment part that you talked about?
Yeah, so I think it's a very important question you're raising, Dean Kamel. You know, it's interesting that technology over the last few months has in fact brought us closer together and has created a sense of community in a way in which probably it did not do so as easily before. So what I think is going to happen going forward is that leaders are going to be much more conscious about the people side as we implement technology. You're seeing this today in decisions taken by IBM and by other companies, tech leaders, who have voluntarily said that they will not deploy facial recognition technology, or they will not give the technology to police departments till the whole ethical considerations of these kinds of technologies are fully understood. So I think what will happen is there will be a greater concern, a greater focus in corporations and governments at trying to understand some of these issues that are being opened up by technologies. And also, I think there should be a greater degree of multiple perspectives brought into the decision-making process. So increasingly, what you're finding is many companies are creating an ethics board with multiple perspectives, just to think more carefully about how is technology being deployed in our organization, how is technology being deployed for addressing customer issues and our customer privacy and other kinds of customer concerns being kept at the top of the agenda. And in many ways, I think this whole notion of putting technology from a non-technology point of view back on the agenda is very high inside both governments and in terms of corporate behavior. Now, having said this, we will have, of course, a few issues that are resolved. There will be cases where governments might try to retain and keep some of the invasive applications alive even after the pandemic has gone. There will be cases where corporations say they'll do something and they do not actually follow up. And that's one reason why regulation will become very critical. There is talk in many countries right now of forming some kind of a nationwide or federal data authority, very similar to a telecoms authority that existed in most companies, forming some kind of a national body to look at data usage, data governance across the country. And I think we will have to come up with some kind of even global mechanisms for trying to have data sharing more encouraged across, or at least managed more carefully across the world. In the COVID crisis, we have seen that if you don't have good data sharing, you cannot actually create the vaccines to the virus that effectively. We're losing time because data is not being shared. And there are all kinds of concerns being raised around global data governance. So I think the whole notion of data governance and how people fit in the equation is something that we'll have to address very carefully.
Well, thank you so much for these insights. You touched upon another important issue, leadership. Yesterday, I was actually a part of a session where we had Tom Friedman, famously wrote one of his books back in 2005, The World is Flat. So in my remarks, I said, you wrote The World is Flat 15 years ago. In January, February, March 2020, we realized that the world is flat, and in no time it became disrupted and dysfunctional, which requires to navigate those difficult times, but more importantly, to move forward and not just sustain the issue, but overcome it, succeed, and thrive in the future as individuals, as organizations, and as societies. Requires a different type of leadership, a different type of vision, a different type of sort of dealing with the challenges. What's your thoughts on what kind of leadership that one needs, a society needs, when it comes to the issue of innovation?
Yeah, I think, the issue of leadership innovation is a very important one. And all of us are born innovative. And I say this not facetiously, I say this because I believe in it. I take the example given by one of my ex-colleagues at INSEAD, Dr. Hal Gregerson, who's now at MIT. He often made the example of saying, look at a 4-year-old in any country. A 4-year-old in any country is keenly observing the environment all the while. Many of you probably have young kids in the family. Young kids, they're always observing. They're always asking questions. They always are experimenting. Even if they break something, they fail something, they keep persevering. They don't give up. And if they have questions or they face trouble, they run to their older children, siblings, older siblings, a parent, uncle, aunt, some mentor network. So people have done studies of innovative leaders and tried to ask what kind of characteristics do they actually exhibit. And the research shows very clearly that these kind of attributes, observation, questioning, experimentation, perseverance, having a right mental network, connecting the dots, these are the attributes of innovative leaders. So a good question to ask is, if every 4-year-old is born that way, what are we doing right or wrong in our schools and universities, such that when they end up in companies and they grow in companies, they're sometimes not perceived as being innovative. So I think that's a good question to ask. Now, having said this, in terms of leadership for innovation, I think what is very important today is for leaders to understand that there are two modes of innovation. One mode is what I can term as a more experimental, more disruptive mode. And a second mode is what I could term as more incremental, a more sort of normal mode of innovation. All companies today have become pretty good at doing this, what I would term as incremental, making small changes and keep on adjusting the market, customer needs. And that is something that we have become reasonably good at. So I think most companies are pretty good at that. The real place where corporations and leaders face problems is what to do in the face of disruptions. When you have disruptive technologies with disruptive business models that change completely what you've been doing for a long time, that doesn't require incremental but dramatic innovations, that's when the challenge comes in. You're a dean of a business school, and like many of the deans of business schools, you also see that technology could potentially disrupt the whole business school. Now, how aggressively do you actually move in that direction requires a lot of courage, a lot of conviction, not just yourself, but also to be able to convince others around you, the students, the staff, the faculty, and of course, the alumni community. If you change the business school model dramatically, there will be a reaction, some positive, some negative in the alumni community. And there will be people who will think it's not the right thing to do. So actually, how do you navigate all those things together is a complex leadership, I would say, opportunity right now for leaders like you, Dean Kamel.
Thank you very much. Now I want to address your professorial status. You were talking about the innovation and the youth and the energy and leapfrogging when it comes to innovation as opposed to incremental innovation. And I think you're absolutely spot on. Some of those people who think of the reactions coming from too much innovation, online learning, there's those distance sort of impediments that we're going through today. Granted, and we all wish that this will not be there for long, how is this, from a counter perspective, affects the social interaction, the exposure, the understanding of the students of the world? For the past 90 days, they were seeing the world through a lens, and that is the screen. But also many universities around the world saying that moving forward, even post-COVID, blended learning probably is going to take center stage. Do you see this as having a bit of a negatives related to it?
So that's a very good point, and people often, I've heard the feedback today, for example, from my own students at Cornell saying that, great, Zoom classes are good for 3 weeks or 1 month, but not for 6 months or a year. And I think they have a point because clearly there are lots of elements in which we can teach via remote technology and that can be improved. But let's take, for example, the experience of a student today on a campus, whether AUC or any other university campus. The in-class teaching is only one part of the experience. I would say a majority of the experience happens outside the classroom, whether it's the social activities or whether it's the other kinds of group work activities or just simple, networking that happens on the campus. And our challenge really is to try to incorporate as much of that as possible in online environments. And we know the future is not going to be purely online. In almost all sectors, it's going to be a blend. And the fact is, some people might want a blend in which the majority is in person. Some people might want a blend in which the majority is virtual. and some people might want to be in the middle, mixing the two. But it is the challenge of the organization to be able to offer that blend. And if your organization is not able to offer that blend effectively, then essentially I think you might be missing out on some opportunities. The point you raised about some of the social connections that are best made today in the physical world, how will they in fact translate to the emotional sort of lack of emotional connections possible today in the virtual world? I would just say that all these things are evolving very quickly. So yes, today maybe the emotional connections are not that strong necessarily in the virtual world, but as technology becomes more intelligent, as you have more intelligent bots and other kinds of agents interacting with human beings, that definition of proximity to technology also is changing. There are research studies that have shown that young teenagers, especially girls, often feel more comfortable talking to these chat bots that are giving them some kind of psychological counseling than to talk to the teacher or to the parents. Why? Because they feel that these chatbots, the design for psychological counseling, they're not being judgmental. They're much less judgmental than the parents or the teachers. And often when teenagers have the crises in the middle of the night, early morning, the school is closed and the parents are not available. So I think what you find is that the way we relate to technology also is changing. And as the technology becomes more intelligent and we personify technologies, when I teach about Alexa in my course at Cornell, I often just let the students teach and talk about it, because more than half the class already has an Alexa in the home. And it's interesting, about 3/4 of the class refer to Alexa as she, her. They already give it some kind of a gender. And I'm just saying this will all change over time, as these relationships of us to technology change, and they will change very quickly. So I think the emotional connections also can be built online, but online is not the only future. The future.
Absolutely. And I think it's still a fluid situation, and it's changing, and it's going to mature, but definitely moving forward, the elements of digitization into our lives is going to be more, and actually it opens up more and more opportunities for people around the world. I have more questions, but let me just announce one thing. Ironically, we're talking about innovation, and as we speak, apparently there is an issue with Zoom as it is now. And unfortunately, all our participants cannot actually post their questions. So I would ask them if you can kindly raise your hand, and the host will allow you to step in and ask your question. But please make it brief. We want to make as much as possible of the time of Professor Dutta, and we only have 15 more minutes to go. So please raise your hand, and the host will allow you in to ask your question. Please be brief, and one question per person. Until we get there, I'm very much of a believer of Africa. And I think I just even wrote an article about Africa. And I think it can be the continent of the 21st century. You talked about incremental growth. Africa is a young continent with 6 of its countries are amongst the fastest growing economies in the world. Of course, we're going to see the impact of COVID, but it all rallies around entrepreneurship and innovation, the power of technology, youth. And one element that strikes me is fintechs. Banks around the world are more fin than tech, and fintechs are all about tech, more tech than fin, moving forward. This is extremely important for financial inclusion. So innovation, Africa, the future, financial inclusion. What's your thoughts on this?
So, I'm a very firm believer in Africa. I think Africa, and including countries like Kenya and Egypt and so on, have great talent, great human talent, great entrepreneurs. And certainly, as you said, it's one of the fastest growing regions of the world, and one of the youngest populations also. I think Africa is going to be a force of the future. It already is a very important force today. And the challenge for Africa is, of course, that it's so huge. Most people don't fully actually understand how big Africa is. I've seen those graphical pictures where inside Africa, you can put Europe, you can put North America, you can put another continent, and you have 3 continents together, that kind of large landmass. So it's a huge landmass, lots of diversity. And I think Africa needs to, of course, improve a few things. You remember what I said about low-income economies? You need to improve the environment. Environmental, when I say regulatory, justice, IP, regulations, all kinds of the environmental factors are critical. If you don't actually, you can have all the technology, but if the environment is bad, and if you have a, not really politically stable environment, nothing much is going to flourish in that country. So I think first is very important is to have that stability and investment in the environment. Of course, you need to invest in people. People investments is great. I think human capital is wonderful. And technology today with e-learning, blended learning, allows much more easy access to high quality learning for African students without having to leave the country or leave the continent. So I think technology access, health access will all improve in Africa over the years. And certainly what I do hope is that African ecosystems, like, for example, what we are seeing emerge in some parts of the world, like in Egypt and also in Kenya, and of course, South Africa and others, will emerge as hubs of global innovation. Today, the global hubs of innovation, not just in North America, but also in Asia. And we need to see more of these hubs emerge in Africa, because Africa is a huge hub for both customers and also innovative ideas. So I'm very, very optimistic about Africa.
Thank you so much. Let's go to the first question and listen to Noha Abdel Hamid.
Thank you very much for a splendid session. I have a question with regard to the future. So as technology is growing much faster than digital literacy, how do you see governments can manage the massive unemployment that comes as a result of that, and as a result of the spread of robots? Do you think that governments could afford to pay universal salaries to their population, and how would that impact? Thank you.
Thank you, Noah, for a very important question. Technology and jobs is high on the agenda for many, many governments. When I talk to political leaders, that's the number one issue they have. Number one often is around fake news and the elections, and number two is around jobs and the election. So jobs are very important, because jobs are necessary for people. Is the basic key element of assuring human dignity. If you don't have a job, you cannot actually put food on the table for your family. It's a very, very important issue for concern and for problems. If you look at the history of technology and jobs, all the data shows that till today, technology has created more jobs than destroyed jobs. Yes, of course, for the people who've lost jobs, it's been a very painful transition, but technology has till today created more jobs as opposed to destroyed jobs. Now, will the future be the same as the past? It's an open question. The different schools of thought out here. Some people feel no, some people feel yes. My personal school of thought is that technology will still create more jobs in the future. The key issue really is, will society be flexible enough to adjust to these changes? Will our schooling system be flexible enough to change the curriculum we teach? Will our educational program be flexible enough to move away from a 4-year program to a program that, for example, Stanford calls open loop learning? Open loop, like you're continuously learning and you do your degree over time in 6, 7, 8 years time. So I think a lot of the investments required by governments, be it in the case of universal basic income, that you talked about, I think the issue is if we invest in people and make the environment flexible to support the growth of new industries, there is a very good chance that we will in fact create new opportunities and new possibilities. And a very good sort of reference point out here is, before the pandemic struck, before the virus came and hit all of us in February of this year, all the rich economies, were at full employment, including the US. So there was no shortage of jobs in all these economies. They had a lot of technology usage, and there was a lot of jobs available. So I think right now the key issue is us being able to be flexible enough and adapt and support human beings and people, society to change.
Thank you so much. I think the key word is adaptation. It's there will be more machines and more robots, but it's our ability to deal with those robots. I just want to go back in time 22 years. I was sitting in a room in Geneva in a convention, and the speaker was one of the founders of the internet, and he goes, you are now excited about people connecting to each other. Wait and see when machines talk to each other. And 22 years later, we only have like, what, 4 billion people talking to each other through the internet, but about 50 billion machines talking to each other. Our next speaker is Ashraf Sheta. Your question, please.
My question is, if you can hear me, Professor Dutta, what will be the impact of the pandemic on the Global Innovation Index? Will you rethink that or the elements that is contained with it?
So, we obviously, thank you, Ashraf, for your question. We obviously have been thinking about this the last few months, because last few months we were in the process of concluding the results for this year, which will release this in the next couple of months. We do not see any change in the basic model itself, but what we are keen to observe, and some of the results will not be visible this year because the data is not that fresh. It'll be only visible in the coming years as the results get more sort of shown in the results that in the data that we use, is how the innovation trends change in the future. We do see that the innovation will accelerate it. That's what our feeling is, at this moment, based on our initial observations. But that remains to be tested and seen. But we do not see the need at this moment to change the innovation model per se, but we will keep observing the results.
I just realized that I told you one of the fathers of the internet and I didn't say the name. It was Vinton Cerf. Trying to sort of follow up the questions and stay online, it's a bit of a challenge. Let's move to our next question. Wasim, your question, please.
Yes, my question is, the professor raised the idea of innovation. He gave the example of Stanford, where in our area, the way we live, Africa, this developed area, where can we see something like what you say, like the Stanford, the partnership between public sector, university, research, and also the kind of a hub for entrepreneurs? Thank you.
Thank you.
So it's an excellent question, Wasim. So thank you so much for asking that. You do need to create ecosystems that bring together the members, as you said. And I think you're seeing ecosystems emerge in different parts of Africa and the Middle East. You certainly have ecosystems, near Cairo. You certainly have ecosystems near Nairobi in Kenya and South Africa, and of course in the Middle East, in Dubai and other places. So I think you are seeing them emerge. The question is, can we in fact make them even stronger? And the challenge is to be able to make them stronger by attracting talent, by providing the right kind of financing for them, because financing is a very important challenge for new startups, and by providing links to other ecosystems around the world, because today innovation does not happen in isolation. When you have an innovative concept, you need to be aware and linked to other similar innovative companies in other parts of the world. So I think this focus on trying to fine-tune ecosystems that have been created is probably the more need of the future, a need of the today, need of the hour. So we already have quite a few ecosystems. The challenge is to strengthen them, in my view.
Thank you. Next question from Ahmed Mukhtar, please.
Hi, good evening. I have a question because recently we have seen that the tech valuations have gone crazy, and that puts a barrier on the sector entry point. What's your take on that and advice on this area? Thank you.
It's very, Ahmed, it's very dangerous to comment on stock prices for companies, because it's something which I don't claim to fully understand, and I don't think so many people claim to fully understand them either. But what is true is that it does reflect the general perception and general feeling of many that these tech companies are going to dominate a large part of our lives, whether personal or in terms of professional or business purposes in the future. You know, in the world of today, where technology is so important, I often use when I teach, I often use a very simple equation to tell my students. I write on the flip chart or blackboard or whatever I'm using, strategy is equal to data. And it's a very simple equation just to say that today, the amount of data you have access to gives you tremendous amounts of possibilities in the kind of strategies you can implement. Because you have more data, you can find more insights and do personalization and so on. And what you're finding, a lot of the big tech players right now, they are becoming bigger and bigger, and they're able to collect more and more data. And that is a source of the competitive advantage. And that's one reason why these big tech players are able to get these enormous benefits of possible growth and valuation and revenues in the future. And the question that is very interesting is what will happen to the others, the other players who don't in fact have access to those large data sets. Today, if you look at the top 20 digital companies in the world, approximately half are American, half are Chinese. Okay, there's not a single top 20 digital leader coming from Europe or from Asia or from India or from Africa or Latin America. And that raises some very interesting questions in terms of, how will these parts of the world compete, or will they in fact be dominated by these large players? So that's a very interesting question. But the valuations you're talking about are largely evaluations of these top 20 players that have gone up a lot. And second, of course, of companies and sectors that have invested very heavily in technology.
Well, Professor Dutta, thank you very much. I know in the conscience of time, we still have a few things to cover. I'll ask the last question. It's not a question. Over the years, you've written so many articles and reports and books that were very enlightening with an eye to the future and openings to what innovation and people and technology can transform organizations and society. So I'm sure somewhere in your drawers, you're preparing for another book. What is it?
Well, thank you, Dean Kamel, for asking this question. But right now, I'm actually very busy and enjoying working on this new book on the new digital agenda. I mentioned some of it. I'm doing this with my co-author, Dr. Bruno Lanva. And the basic message really out there is what I said earlier, is that the pendulum has shifted too much towards the concern from the hope, and we have to bring the pendulum back to the center. And for that, we need a new agenda for action, both from governments and from businesses and from individuals. And if we all don't come together collectively, we will fundamentally not be able to build a fruitful future for all of us. Example being the whole Cambridge Analytica Facebook scandal that, got a lot of attention in America and UK because it potentially changed last elections in the US of the president and also the Brexit decision of the UK public. People have come to realize that technology can actually sway, influence people's decisions in multiple ways. And if we don't actually regulate or control in some meaningful way, we will not be able to even have the basic governance of democracy or whatever method you choose operate inside a country. And if you cannot trust a company that says it will do X and does not do X, you can actually monitor that. That will again create all kinds of breaches in customer faith and customer loyalty. So what people have realized is that we do need to come back to technology governance. And in this governance equation, as I said in the earlier days, the whole notion of how you put people at the center. So a people-centric view of technology is the core focus of my next book. Thank you, Dean Kamel.
Thank you so much. So we have a new norm and you have a new agenda for action, but regardless how the norm will look like, people will always be at the center. And I think that's a very, very strong message. We can go on for another hour, I know that, but I'm conscious of your time and everybody's time. I would like to thank you, Professor Dutta, for being with us today. I would like to thank all the participants on behalf of the School of Business of the American University in Cairo and the American Chamber of Commerce in Egypt. It has been a delight to listen to your insights and your overview of what's happening today, moving forward, how innovation and people can transform societies and organizations. Thank you all, and please stay tuned to the next edition of the Willard Brown International Business Leadership Webinar Series. Stay safe, everyone. Thank you so much. Bye-bye.